Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Accelerate webinar series hosted by the Daniels College of Business Executive Education Department. I'm Camila Gini, Assistant Director of Business Development, and I'll be your host today. The Accelerate webinar series is designed to help you accelerate your capacity to deliver results for your organization. Our webinar today will be about 25 minutes long, starting with a brief presentation from our faculty and then moving to questions and answers at the end. To help us see your questions, please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to submit a question whenever you'd like, and we'll answer as many questions as possible at the end of the session. If we run out of time, we'll include an answer to your questions in an email follow-up to you. Today, we're pleased to have Brendan Daruna join us again in our webinar. Brendan is the Chief of the Gilpin Ambulance Authority and a 20-year EMS veteran. Currently, he serves in several boards, including the Foothills RETAC Board of Directors, the Gilpin County LEPC and Emergency Service Council, and the North Central Region WASI Board of Directors. Brendan holds an executive MBA from the University of Denver and is a faculty member teaching in executive education for several customized classes and for the Public Safety Leadership Development Program, which we'll talk about more at the end of our webinar. Today, Brendan joins us to discuss the benefit of failure and how successful organizations create a culture that shares and celebrates mistakes. Brendan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Camilla. I appreciate that. And thank you guys for joining us today. I'm really happy to be here, really happy to talk about failure as a person that happens to fail a lot. So the general thesis of this talk is going to be really about how failure in our organizations and individually is really important for us to be successful. I want you to sort of join me in considering what celebration of failure may feel like to you. And I want you to pause just for a second here and just acknowledge any feelings you might have. So as we start talking about how failure is an important thing, how does that make you feel? All right, now that you've got that feeling registered, we're going to come back to that later in the talk. I really want to start off by saying, many people would say that our culture is one that does already celebrate failure. In fact, as you start to think about the sort of stories we tell ourselves in moments of failure, you start to think about things that, may acknowledge some understanding that failure is a part of success. So we all know the famous story about Albert Einstein. He didn't pass the entrance exam into his university the first time around. And certainly, if I had failed and told myself that story, I'm not an Albert Einstein, but certainly it'd be nice to hear that after I had a failure. We also know, Michael Jordan got cut from his high school basketball team. Can you imagine the greatest basketball player in the world gets cut from his high school basketball team? So we tell ourselves these stories and we think, that means that we're acknowledging the benefit of failure. But I would suggest we use language that really is deceiving in that expression. So what we say often is, instead of Albert Einstein or Michael Jordan were successful because of their failure, we say they were successful in spite of, or they had setbacks throughout their career, but they were able to overcome them and become successful. I think it's really, really an important distinction, because as we sort of move forward in a culture of celebrating failure, we have to recognize that the way we describe our failures is germane to our sort of mental model and our impression of whether that failure was a part of our success or whether we were successful despite the fact that we had a failure. I would suggest I would suggest that failure is one of the most important parts of us being successful. So when I was researching this, one of the things we don't really realize is that there's all these people in our culture who have started their careers from a foundation of failure, and they really don't talk about it themselves. So often when you're sort of engaging in conversations with these famous earth-shaking people, they won't really acknowledge the fact that some of their original, my slide there is blank. It's not loading. Doesn't matter, they're just pictures of people. So some of these original people didn't actually have this sort of foundation of success that then was built upon. They really had several iterations of failure. And that was the thing that became most important for them being successful. And all the pictures that you would have seen, had this thing been working correctly, were all pictures of Harvard dropouts. So it turns out that dropping out of Harvard is actually probably a better credential in graduating from Harvard, because some of the people that are sort of masters of our universe right now were Harvard dropouts. But sort of not acknowledging the fact that sort of didn't fly. The sort of baseline point there is that there is more people in our culture today who are driving success that started and continue to fail during the course of their careers. And that, I think, is an important nuance. Now, we have to take a time out and we have to recognize there is also privilege that exists in this being able to be successful in failure, especially when we're talking about people who have taken great leaps early in their career. There is a component of privilege that allows people to be successful because of a net. And so, you know, the delineation between someone that has a net and can be bold and take huge risks and someone that maybe doesn't have the ability to have that sort of risk is definitely admissible in the conversation. So I want to recognize and acknowledge the fact that certainly functioning with a net makes it far easier to have this bold sort of embracing and celebration of failure. So again, we're having slide issues. So I apologize for the slide issues. This is supposed to be a baby who is learning to walk. And I will tell you why I have that slide in just one second. But the question that sort of we're faced with is this fear of failure, and more importantly, I think, is the shame associated with failure, is that related to something that's innate and that is inherent in us as people, or is that something that's learned? And I would suggest we all know that young children have very clear aversion to risk. So, you know, it's foundational for us to be concerned about anything that might risk our lives, anything that might risk our livelihood, anything that might make us scared. That's certainly kind of, I think, a fundamental part of us being young people and growing. And we see that in children who are afraid of depth and afraid of falling and certainly afraid of strangers and don't want to be separated. We see a very clear aversion to risk. But what we don't see in kids, especially in their younger years, is a fear of failure. I would suggest we see the absolute opposite. So what we instead see is we see kids boldly failing to be successful. So imagine if when you were a young child, there's actually a gentleman in the room who was just talking about his toddler who's learning to toddle. Imagine when you're at that age, you fall down and you think to yourself, you know, I'm just going to crawl. I'm not going to engage failure again. There's too much shame associated with it. And I'm just going to move forward with what I know how to do instead of taking this bold risk. The same goes with everything that children learn early on. And so the question for us is, how does this social construct of shame affect our willingness and interest in taking bold steps? This is the place where we really need to understand how our aversion to and fear of failure affects our ability to be successful. Excuse me. So I want you to go back to the beginning of the talk and think to yourself, what were those feelings that you had? Be very clear in your mind about the things that that sort of emotion that you had when we talked about celebrating failure. And imagine to yourself, is that preventing me from accomplishing the things that I would like to accomplish? And take that one step further. Imagine for a second what you could accomplish without fear of failure. It's clear that as we move forward in our lives, and we are able to free ourselves from the idea of shame, that we can press forward into an opportunity to be successful without that fear. And losing that fear is something that is very important to us. So how does this transition from being afraid of failure potentially going to be successful in your individual lives and in your organizations? Important. But first we have to understand how the downsides of fear affect our ability to be successful. So what happens when we are really consumed with fear is that there's several things that sort of sabotage our ability to be successful. And one of the ones that's the most important, and I have the most experience with, is a reluctance to get started. So when one is considering the downsides and sort of in a really systematic way trying to understand how to avoid failure, one is far less likely to take the first step. And that first step is significantly delayed. So instead of going boldly forth, like the child that's trying to learn how to walk, we stop and we consider, we sort of work out all the potential outcomes because we're really afraid of the shame associated with not doing well. And certainly I'm a perfect example of that today. The slides didn't work, and it is an opportunity for me to just say, okay, this isn't going to work. But the shame associated with failing is not something that should register in my interest in being successful. So we also do sort of what I would call self-sabotage, which is maybe could be called procrastination, certainly could be in the realm of delay or of not putting effort into something to be successful. But at the end of the day, what we're doing is we're registering an excuse so that when we do fail, if there's an opportunity that we have failed, we can sort of fall back on that excuse. We can say, well, I would have been successful today, but I really didn't put the effort in that was necessary. That's a self-sabotaging setup. So because we are afraid of the shame associated with failure, we are not engaging with our full capability. And when we sort of start reducing our capability when it comes to being successful in these situations, we kind of reap what we sow. You're not able to be successful because you have sort of limited yourself in a self-sabotaging way. The back end of failure is just as bad. So as we sort of set ourselves up to fail and then fail, the shame that's associated from a societal pressure because we have failed then reduces our capability moving forward. So that is how an individual would sort of engage this. But I want you to think for a second, how do individuals in your organization who potentially are in this cycle affecting your organization's ability to be successful? And that's sort of where we want to have a paradigm shift. So we want to build cultures that really enable failure and celebrate it and really recognize the worth of going boldly forth, making a mistake, recognizing the mistake, sharing it widely, and then trying again. And that's iterative success. So we want to try, fail. We want to fail as quickly as we can. We want to recognize what we've done wrong and then move back into a try and hopefully success loop. And by doing that, we will have more individual capability, but we'll also have more capability in our organizations. And that's kind of what we're after, right? So how do we do that? How do we build a culture that allows us to be able to fail boldly and celebrate failure on our pathway to success? And I would suggest there's a few ways. One of the things that's happened in the last years, sort of emergence of the data culture. And we see how data has reduced our individual fear about failure by really giving us a fair perspective of the likelihood. And we see that a lot in sports. So my example that I always think of when I think of how data is affecting our ability to really perceive the potential of failure is in football. So for years, for 50 years of football, nobody ever went on a fourth down play. There was always a reluctance because there was a worry that potentially that choice was a choice that would harm them in the long run. And the reason that choice was made is because humans naturally have an aversion to risk. And we naturally, even if we're trying to critically evaluate and objectively evaluate a situation, we move towards the area of safety just as a matter of function of us being successful. But what data allows us to do is level the playing field. So when we really understand a problem and we really have a data analytic understanding of the potential outcomes, we can make a much more educated choice. By doing that, we can really engage in the solution as opposed to being worried about being in the safe space. So data is a really big component of creating a culture of success in embracing failure. We also see, this sort of process, this objective evaluation of failure in our scientific method. And in fact, when you look at medicine, the way we have developed and progressed all the technologies in science is a clear understanding that failure has to be a part. And unfortunately, if you look at industries like aerospace and industry like medicine, they share broadly their failures and learn from them. And so as we're building these sort of structures in our organizations, one of the most important things is for the leader to take ownership over their own failures, to be willing to go forth and tell the other people in the organization how they've become successful through their failures and open the doors to everybody sharing that sort of culture. So a culture that allows and embraces failure has to start from the top. And then we need to have structures so that we can share these mistakes. We need to be able to have wide acceptance of a fail point, a particular employee, a project, sharing that widely so that people can learn from it, and then recognizing that those lessons will significantly benefit our organizations. I'll leave you with this last thought. It is in a world that is significantly complex and is changing at a pace that we can't understand, is exceedingly important to become anti-fragile or benefit from negative inputs in our organizations. In order to do that, we have to build into our organizations the sort of ability to benefit from these failure points. And as we do that, we will have an opportunity to build solid relationships with our employees, because the solid relationship that you build with your employee through their failure is far more beneficial than the relationship you build through success. And we know that the best and most high-performing teams have emotional safety and deep, meaningful relationships. That can be yielded, in my opinion, far better through failure than through success. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure. Camilla?
Thank you so much, Brennan. For everyone that who's been watching us for a while, you know that we've never had this live issue. And then today that had to happen. And I think we were just chosen because of the topic
Sure.
that we're talking about. So I want to see if we have any questions from the audience, and it looks like we do. Let me just pull up the first question. So, Brendan, do you think we ought to seek out opportunities to fail, sort of like practicing failure?
Yeah, I think that anytime that you have the opportunity to feel failure and then not associate it with shame, that's a huge benefit. And so it becomes routine. Certainly when it counts, when it's something that you're really passionate about, you're not going to have the same emotional response.
Yeah, we were talking about this before we got started. Those people that just go out and film themselves trying out different ways to failure just to get more comfortable
Right.
with that every day.
Right. There's a social stigma here, and we need to start to recognize that in our organizations, we can change the paradigm and we can build failure as a part of success.
Perfect. We did get another question from Dylan, and he asked, what example of failure do you have in your life or someone that you know that you have overcome?
So you want to, is it more than the slides is what you're asking, I guess. I had a career setback. I'll use the language that I said is not the right language, right? But it was certainly employment where I was fired. And at the beginning, when I sort of first engaged the fact that I had been fired, I thought to myself, this is going to be a huge detriment to my career. The reality is the lessons I learned through the course of failing in that way have benefited me far, far more than anything that I lost during the process.
Perfect. Good. Well, Brendan, thank you so much for being with us today. Really appreciate it. And to all of our participants, thank you for taking the time to join us today. If you liked what Brendan shared, you have to learn more about the Public Safety Leadership Development Program. PSLD combines world-class faculty with personal assessments, leadership exercises, analytical assignments, and challenging activities to provide a life-changing experience and help develop public safety emerging leaders in our local communities. The next cohort will be coming up in February, and you can learn more about it in our website. We will be back on Thursday, November 18, with Bo Starosic to talk about how to create a meaningful hybrid experience. Once again, thank you for joining us today. We hope you gain new insight that will accelerate your impact in your community, your organization, and the world. From the University of Denver Daniels College of Business Executive Education Department, we look forward to seeing you again on the Accelerate webinar series. Thank you, everyone.